Gentlemen, take a seat. Thank you very much. If folks, whenever we came up with the idea of BelTech, the main thrust was going to be discussions as opposed to presentations. I felt it was worthwhile introducing a few presentations, including Jace's, and I agree with pretty much everything you said, Jace, and particularly the TransLink plea. Please make the data available publicly. But we'd like to move on to the first of, I guess, the mainstream discussions. And one of the areas that is of significant interest both to the technologists in the room but also the business users in the room, I suspect, is the concept of agility, agile project management, whatever you want to call it. So to that end, we've put together a panel with the academic, the practitioner, and the business user, if that doesn't sound like the opening to a bad joke. I shouldn't jinx it, sorry. So can we just kick off with some introductions? Can you just give us an overview of who you are and a little bit of your background? So starting with you, David.
Okay, my name's David Bustard. I'm from the University of Ulster, and I've been in the computing business for a bit over 40 years now. Most of that has been in the academic field, although I have spent some time in industry and worked collaboratively with people in industry. As far as today's concerned, I have an interest in software engineering broadly, of which Agile is a part. And perhaps the thing that's most relevant that may come up is the fact that I took part in two surveys, one in 2010, one in 2012, into Agile use within Northern Ireland, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. But currently I'm interested in optimal Agile use, which includes its use perhaps in other areas other than software development.
Thanks, David. Andrew?
Okay, so my name's Andrew Jackson. I currently work at Kenos Software as a delivery manager. I've spent, nearly 20 years now working in the IT industry. I've been a software developer, I've been a software architect. I guess most of the time I've spent more on sort of project and delivery management. I've worked in sort of more traditional ways of delivering software, as well as working with more agile and iterative methods. And I guess just one other thing I would say in relation to my own career is, prior to getting into IT, I actually had some formative years. I trained and worked as a manufacturing engineer, and there's an interest and a comparison there for me, because at the time that I was doing that, all about 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion around lean manufacturing and lean thinking. So it's been interesting for me to see that the IT industry is almost coming full circle to try and adopt some of those lean practices, as well as some of the agile practices that they have. Okay.
Thanks, Anna. Really delighted to have Neil with us. Neil, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. My name is Neil Barlow. I work for an organisation called the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency, which is an organisation in Great Britain, kind of the equivalent of the Driver Vehicle Agency here in Northern Ireland. So my job's nothing to do with IT. I run the car MOT scheme over there, and I've had a number of roles, often with a sort of engineering bent. But I've often been the customer of IT. I'm currently working on a large project to replace all of the IT for our 22,500 garages that do MOTs, which is sort of about 30 million tests a year. And that's an agile project, but I too have had experience of working as the customer for some more traditionally delivered IT projects in the past, including some that have not gone particularly well. So have some interesting experiences looking back.
Thank you, Neil. Now, we're going to set aside plenty of time for questions from the floor towards the end, so please start preparing your questions. But to kick the discussion off, I guess I'd like just to understand what Agile means to each of the panelists. Dave?
Okay, well, I've been aware of Agile since the term was first coined in 2001, but as I introduced myself as someone who's been in the business for quite some time, a lot of the ideas were already kicking around before that. But 2001 was very significant for several reasons. One is that the term Agile itself was a major step forward. because up until then there'd been certainly a lot of focus on trying to get software developed as efficiently and effectively as possible. And there'd been talk about rapid application development and essentially just trying to find ways of doing things faster. But the notion of lean, and particularly the first book that came out from Alistair Coburn, showed a tiger on the front of the book as well. So it suggested something very virile and something that was going to make a difference in terms of the approach that was taken. So when the first concept came out, perhaps the most significant thing was the fact that there were a number of consultants who got together effectively to produce this concept. And that agreement, I think, had quite an effect on people looking at it seriously. So from my point of view, although a lot of the concepts were around beforehand, 2001 was a landmark point where the ideas really took off, and lots of people in the industry then started to look at the ideas very seriously.
Thanks. So Andrew, same question. What does Agile mean to you in your environment?
Okay, so I can just pick on something that David said there. He mentioned 2001, and I guess I think that was a real turning point, I suppose, in coming together and a lot of the concepts around Agile. The introduction at that point of something called the Agile Manifesto, that's still valid and relevant today, and it talks about a number of core values, a number of core principles that really anybody considering doing Agile development in the IT world should adhere to. I think those are still equally valuable today, and to me that really is a tenet of what Agile is so important, or what makes Agile so important and so relevant and so valuable. The main driver for me is, it's really about building confidence for the customer that they're actually going to get something that not necessarily meets a specification that they've spent months or years putting together. It's getting confidence that the solution, the product, whatever it happens to be, that they need for their organization is coming together. And at the end of that period, it's going to be the right fit for their organization. So it's making the mental shift from, I'm delivering what we asked to deliver, to actually delivering the right thing. And so that's the real basis of Agile for me.
Neil?
I guess just to follow that on, what I see in terms of what Agile gives me is it's given me something, product much earlier. So particularly for the work I'm involved in, I've got a very complex customer base, a lot of customers. What it's given me is product early that I can wave in front of them, show them, check that it meets their needs. It's far from a finished product, but it does give me something early. So in terms of having confidence that we're going along the right lines, bringing customers on board, working in that collaborative sort of way and iteratively producing product, that to me is the substantial difference in approach from more traditional ways where perhaps I've waited tentatively for months and then been disappointed with what I've seen at the end.
Sure. Now, that feels like a very obvious benefit to the business. Are there other obvious benefits that you can articulate?
I think that sort of iterative approach in my mind is a key benefit. There's disadvantages to it in terms of the intensity needed from a business point of view, in terms of business involvement. It does put a responsibility back on us to be there, be constantly engaging, constantly making ourselves available. So I think sometimes perhaps, where it can be seen as a cop-out from making decisions, it isn't that at all. So, it's a very intense process, but hopefully, certainly from what I've seen so far, it does lead to us getting something that we actually want and our customers want.
Sure. I accept the point about the intensity of the engagement, but is that, a downside? Because it kind of sounds like if you as a business expect an organization who probably is not intimately familiar with your business to be able to deliver something that you need that level of engagement anyway.
Yeah, and it's perhaps wrong to describe it as a downside. I think it's about as an organization, delivering an Agile project, what we've got to be is prepared for that level of intensity. And, perhaps we weren't, perhaps nobody is quite prepared for it.
Sure. So, Andrew, from the perspective of a technology delivery organization, what do you see as the key benefits?
If you don't mind, I'll come to that in a second. I would just sort of add something to what Neil said as well. I think one of the challenges with Agile, particularly from the customer, from the business's point of view, is making that leap, if you like, from having previously said, we have this set of requirements and my job's done, I can hand this over to the suppliers now, and I'm confident that the responsibility is on them to deliver. It's making that kind of leap of faith almost to sort of say, you know what, this is going to be an ongoing process, and we're going to have to engage very, very frequently to continue to revise what we want. And I think while it's a challenge, I think it's one of the huge benefits of Agile from the customer's point of view. From the delivery team's point of view, my own personal experience is that the technical side of the house, the software engineers, the developers, the testers, in fact everybody involved in the delivery side, generally really appreciates and enjoys working in an Agile environment. They feel more empowered, they feel closer to the customer, so I think they get a greater perception of what they're delivering is actually going to do to improve the business or the lives of people in the business or the lives of the people that they represent. And so I generally find that if done well, Agile can be a real empowering and motivating tool for the development teams.
Can we just probe into that a little more for a second? I mean, what do you see as, I guess, the benefits for the technical practitioners in the teams?
I think they're much closer to the customer. So they have a much greater appreciation of what they're developing actually needs to do in its simplest sense, and what it needs to look like to meet the needs of what that customer requires.
Sure. I've heard Agile, nothing keen enough, mind you, it being called Disneyland for developers. How would you respond to that?
Well, yes, that is a perception. My own perception would be that's Agile done badly, or Agile not done at all. Agile is not about throwing away documentation. It's not about throwing away process at all. It is very structured. In fact, in many ways, it's more structured and more intensive than more traditional ways of doing things, because things are happening on a very frequent basis. It may be on a weekly or fortnightly or monthly basis that we're producing workable software solutions. There is a lot of stuff that needs to happen behind the scenes to make that work effectively. I always go back to the Agile Manifesto and a number of its core values. I mean, it is very clear in saying that things like individuals and interactions between those individuals is more important than, for example, processes and tools. But it's not to say that processes and tools aren't required. They absolutely are. My own experience, for example, we still have to write down requirements in an Agile world. We just do it in a slightly different way. Rather than having, a telephone directory of requirements that's taken months to prepare, we do it in a very lightweight way. We write something called user stories, and we make those very visible to users. But things are documented, and we revisit those requirements on a very regular basis. So I think I'm aware of the concept of Agile as Disneyland for developers. That to me is Agile not done very effectively at all.
Okay. Dave, what about from your perspective, I guess, particularly from the educator's perspective?
Well, I think the key benefit has already been mentioned, and that's iterative development. And it benefits not just the customer, but also the developer. Because I think with the old approach was essentially you think about producing a product in one step. There'd be a requirement stage, a design stage, implementation, and delivery. And all of that was typically, back in the 1980s, 90s, taking 18 months, perhaps even longer. And that was difficult for everyone, because the customer at various stages was often asked to sign off on requirements or sign off on design. They didn't actually have any product, so they had to go and trust in many cases. But now with the iterative approach, you're typically delivering something in 3 months, something that's of value, so the customer is getting something out of it and they can see where it's going. So whenever they're signing off on a stage payment, then they can see what they're going to get for their money. But the fact also that you're trying to do it in this stage way means that you're reducing the overall risk to a project. Because typically in the past, you could go 18 months and then suddenly someone announces, actually it's going to take longer and substantially longer. I was at a conference in the 1980s, I remember, and someone from the Ministry of Defence spoke to me about a system that had they'd just taken delivery of after 5 years. And their initial approach was very conservative, and as a result of that, although the system was working and they were going to pay for it, everything had changed over that time. The technology had changed, the requirements had changed. So actually the system, although it was right with respect to the initial perspective, it wasn't actually something of great value to the end user. So the iterative approach is massively valuable to everyone, because apart from anything else, if you're a developer, there's no satisfaction in producing a system that gets mothballed or cancelled halfway through. Every developer wants to have satisfaction that what they do results in a system that end users find valuable. So I think that iterative aspect of it is core and extremely valuable. But one of the benefits of Agile is there's lots of other things that have come on top of that as well, and that's why I think it's been so significant. It's not just the iterative approach, because that was already there and a possibility before 2001.
Thank you, Dave. Before we go to the floor, I guess I've just got one specific question, primarily for Neil. We're seeing significant interest and a specific demand from the public sector for Agile-based projects. I mean, can you give us any insights into why you think there is such a shift towards the Agile way of delivery in the public sector? If I guess from your own business perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I only know it from what I see in DVSA. I think the reality of why DVSA's adopted an Agile approach is because we've been told to. And then there's been a very clear lead from Cabinet Office that we should do so. That's not to say that we shouldn't have done anyway, but we probably wouldn't have known. We're not IT experts, that's not what we do. We know stuff about cars and things, hopefully. But I think, why we're being told to, why we're being encouraged to, in my mind, there's a big thrust within government about thinking about the end user, not just thinking from a government doing things to citizens and businesses, and actually making government services responsive to user needs. I think Agile helps us do that. It very much does certainly adopt a philosophy throughout of thinking about the user need rather than thinking about some theoretical requirement in my head as a policymaker. So I think that's a big part of it. I think the other part of it is government hasn't got a great track record with IT. And whether Agile has any better track record, but certainly it probably can't have any worse track record than some of the historically badly delivered IT projects that have been in government. So we ought to be trying something different. We ought to be thinking about lower risk ways of delivering IT in perhaps a less costly way than has been done in the past.
Yeah, just one add to that. There's one term that's thrown around quite often, and that's failing faster.
Yeah.
So if you have an ill-founded project, then it's going to be brought to the surface much faster than waiting the typical length of time for that to appear.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Happy to take questions from the floor now. Has anybody got any questions? Is there a mic for us? Okay. Anybody got questions? I can't see, so.
There's a couple here.
Okay. Can you introduce yourself and just tell us the question, please?
Okay, it's Jane Brady from Kernel Capital. In my previous careers, I've a lot of experience of using Agile very effectively. However, we've always struggled with using Agile in a hardware design methodology. And I guess due to the nature of the cycle it is. So I just wondered if the panel had any experiences using it kind of in a more hardware and deep design methodologies applicable.
Okay, that's a really good question, Jane. I might even broaden it out a little bit. So, I mean, what about the experiences of making use of Agile in a non-software environment, hardware specifically, but also, say, a process environment?
Just from my point of view, and I think I'm very much sort of on the margins of this, but I suppose I see where in my organisation, very civil servant-y type of organisation, we're using Agile for software development. What we're not using Agile for is policy development, procedural change, and that creates some challenges actually. I think actually to get the most out of Agile, we need to think about how we use consistent approaches across everything we do, not just across software development. I think that's quite a challenge for the civil service to change its way of thinking to work through some of those things like policy development in a different way. But actually, I think we have to get the most of Agile from a software development point of view.
Okay. And from a policy development perspective, I apologise, Jane, I know I'm taking it away slightly. Can you see specific benefits to using Agile to help drive the policy changes?
Yes, both. I think that there are benefits in doing that, about being a little more iterative in how we go about these things, but also I think to get the full benefits out of using Agile for software development, we've got to be more agile in how we change those things. What we can't have is understanding user needs to build a piece of software, then getting into a 20-year cycle of regulatory change to actually meet that customer need. We've got to think differently in government.
Sure. So hardware?
Yeah, just in terms of the survey, we essentially were aiming at software development companies, but some of them were more systems-oriented companies like Andor, for example, and Tyco, where you're developing software in parallel with equipment that has to be driven by it. I guess the difficulty with pure hardware work is that it's a bit like hard engineering in essence. It isn't evolving to the same extent. It isn't as malleable as software. So in essence, you don't often have the luxury of delivering in steps. You often have to have a complete system. You have a complete camera, or you have a complete bridge, or whatever it is you're producing. You can't have half a bridge that's still useful. So that's the limitation of it. But for the moment, I guess that the main focus is on software and its impact in systems in general. And it's been, from the surveys, very beneficial in those areas.
David, it sounded like you were referring to the minimal viable product concept there.
Yeah, well, what's important, I suppose, for I guess all product providers is getting to the market fast enough, and that's extremely valuable. So and I think Agile is helpful in that respect. During the survey, there was a certain reluctance by many of the software development companies to admit that they actually could produce things cheaper than before. So what they were typically saying was that you got a better product in the same time. But there were some people off the record were saying effectively they got a better product in half the time. And I think that's a key aspect of it. So whether it's hardware or software or systems, you are aiming to somehow get things out faster now than ever before, because there's a competitive marketplace.
Okay.
There's a particularly good analogy that I've seen a few times with regarding to introducing this concept of the minimal viable product and how that relates to Agile. And I think Spotify, for example, often uses the people that provide the music service because they're very big into Agile development themselves. But one of the analogies they draw is if you take it away from software and IT and think about, for example, my objective here is to build a vehicle to take me to work. In the old way of doing things, what you might have done is, okay, I want to build a vehicle, that means I need a car, so what am I going to do? I'm going to build the chassis first, then I'm going to build the wheel assembly first and plug all that together, then I'm going to build an engine, then I'm going to put a shell over all of that. And through that process, I can start to show my customers, my users, here's the wheels, here's the chassis, here's what the body of the vehicle is going to look like. But the issue is, until you get to the point where all of that stuff is assembled together, you don't have a product. A set of wheels on its own is no use for getting somebody to work. So by comparison, the Agile approach would say something like, well, actually, I need a vehicle to get me to work. What's the simplest viable thing that I can use? In this case, it might sound trivial, it could be a skateboard. Okay, we can build a skateboard very easily. All we need is a piece of wood or a bit of carbon fiber and some wheels. We can plug that together and we can start going to work and we can start to get feedback from the users. Okay, so this skateboard's great, but it's not particularly stable. I keep falling off and bumping my head. I could put some handlebars on it and get myself into a mini scooter. So you're evolving into the next round of the product. Okay, some further feedback, and we said, well, that's great. I've got a mini scooter with handlebars, but I'm coming to work every day and I'm sweat's pouring off me because it's just far too much physical work. What are we going to do? Well, we could put some pedals on it and turn it into a bicycle. That takes a little bit of the effort out of it, and it evolves. And you might end up, for example, taking it to the level where you put an engine on it, it becomes a motorbike. It's not a car that we originally thought we were going to have, but we have a motorbike. And you know what? Actually, that's pretty good. That's all I need. I've got a minimal viable product, but what I've got all the way through that is a number of iterative ways of delivering a product that the user can see and get feedback on. And I may end up at a different place and a much cheaper product, a motorbike, than where I originally envisaged, which was a vehicle. So I always think that's a really good analogy to sort of convey what the minimal viable product is all about. In terms of your comment specifically around hardware, I've got no personal experience of having done hardware in that environment, but I do know that some of the principles that we use in software development in my own organization we've used outside of the engineering teams. So we use concepts like, it's more related to lean, like Kanban, for example. We use that in HR functions and in legal functions to manage a continuous flow of work and identify bottlenecks and try and provide process improvements and eliminate waste in that process. So I would guess, regardless of what discipline you're in, I would say there's certainly a scope to use that in an organization that's predominantly producing hardware. I would say some of the other concepts that come from extreme programming, XP, like daily stand-ups, I think really, really effective for any kind of team that you have. So rather than having formal meetings once a week to review progress, getting all the teams, everybody in the team together at a regular time every morning, typically 9 o'clock, 9:30 in the morning, and every individual has to say what they did yesterday, what they're planning to do today, and what blockers are they. A really sharp 15, 20-minute session. I see that as being very effective in terms of any type of project or operational team that you have.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay.
This sounds like a discussion that we could valuably continue in the breakout session after this session. I think we've got time for one more question from the floor. Anybody got a question?
Hi, my question's for Neil. I'm a project manager on an Agile development team at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange here. I was just curious I'm not sure whether you, based on prior negative experiences with more traditional projects, went looking for a better way to do things, or whether it was pitched to you. So I was curious whether you had any skepticism about working in an Agile project delivery method, and were there any concerns that you had about that which have been addressed to your satisfaction, or do you have any negative associations with it that remain?
So I guess, how do we take first steps in Agile? How do we get buy-in? Were there any downsides or skepticism?
I think it is quite challenging, I think, particularly breaking through quite traditional ways of thinking. And I think there's a lot of people believe the sort of more traditional waterfall approach where you might get a big set of requirements, then get some sort of fixed price quote against that, that provides certainty. And I think particularly in the civil service, we like our process, we like our bureaucracy that goes with that, we like our approving of business cases and firmly believing that when the business case says it's going to cost £2 million, that's actually what it will cost. Agile doesn't pretend to do that, and that makes people feel uncomfortable. So the reality for our organisation as to why we've done it and how we got through that skepticism was by being told to do it. So I suspect we'd have struggled with some of those things if we hadn't been told to do it. But I think, being able to show that some of those traditional ways of thinking, that actually if you look back at the history of all of those fixed price big projects we had that were going to cost £2 million, actually in the end they probably cost £8 million and didn't work properly. And it's kind of reminding people of those facts that, the more traditional ways of working haven't been that great. And, yes, there are some risks with this approach, but there were some pretty big risks with other ways of working. And I think people soon forget that. So I think there's just a big job of reminding people that other ways of working are in no way perfect.
So it sounds like a top-down mandate was quite important for your scenario.
In my mind, that worked for us. I guess, I'd like to think that other organisations can just get hold of this and give this a go. Sometimes one does need a bit of a push to move in the right direction.
A few thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, I think ultimately a top-down remit to go agile is certainly preferable, but I think the reality is that may not come in a lot of organizations, and I think a lot of success has been more from bottom up, and we have teams, internal teams, doing some agile stuff by stealth on a little project, and growing their own experiences, and developing their own credibility and sharing that with the wider organization. I think Neil hit it really on the head. It's a confidence thing for a lot of organizations, being able to make that leap of faith, if you like, from we have a contract here and we know what we're expected to get delivered, and we can put that entire responsibility onto our supplier, for example, to do that. And it's making that shift to say we're kind of have to share some of the risk here, but the big win for everybody is that we're probably going to have a better solution at the end. It's going to be a better fit for our organization, and we're going to see it earlier.
Okay, but it isn't all sweetness and light. I mean, what hasn't worked particularly well in your environments?
One of the challenges I see, actually, and I think I can see it works very well with a blank sheet of paper. And when you're developing new services, I think it is more challenging when you're replacing existing services. I think on the particular service I have responsibility for, I'm very lucky. I've got a lot of control myself to change and develop that service, and I think that works from an agile point of view. But when you're trying to do a kind of like-for-like technology refresh of IT, I think it can have some challenges when all of the boundaries are sewn up around cost, time, and scope. That I'm not saying Agile can't work, but I think it's quite challenging to see it work in that environment. I don't think you get the benefits from Agile in those sorts of projects, perhaps.
Okay, so one learning experience, Andrew?
I would say, I don't know if there's one learning experience necessarily, but what I would sort of say is, we talked about before, the Disneyland for developers. Please don't consider Agile as a way to just throw away all of the process and all the documentation. I think that's where I've seen, and I'm aware of Agile having failed, because people think it's a case of just tearing up all the rule books and just Disneyland for developers.
Okay, I'm not asking you a question, Dave, but I think you'll have a lot to add here. I mean, it feels like you in the University of Ulster are teaching Agile as the way things are done. That is the default project management methodology that your students are being taught. Correct?
That's right, yes.
Okay, so we're now going to have a cohort of junior software engineers coming into the industry with an expectation that everything's agile. I guess it's a question for the floor. How do we respond to that expectation? Are they going to be disappointed, or are we going to make use of that latent talent? I don't know.
Well, it's not as simple as just us telling them, here's the Agile approach and that's the way to do it. We do provide sort of historical context. We do talk about waterfall, and we say that it's still a mixture out there. But we certainly emphasize the benefits of Agile, and they're so substantial that they're hard to ignore. I think that's the bottom line. But historically, Agile has been driven from the bottom. It has been developers who've been particularly interested in it, even when higher level management haven't been so convinced. The most successful situations are where it is top down, where somebody at the top says, this is what we're going to do. So particularly for large organizations, in a very short space of time, they can all be forced to look at this model. And I think it is important that people do try it out. Because what I found in the survey was there were some companies who felt they were doing okay and didn't particularly want to have the disruption of moving to a new process. So they tried to talk up what they were doing as effectively agile. But it is important to try out a process. And what we found, for example, was that 80% of the companies that were using Agile were basing it on Scrum or some variation of Scrum, which is really just an Agile framework. There's lots of practices that go on top of that. But you need to be able to start at that level and have some sort of simple iterative process with all the review and all the basic elements present in it. And if you've tried that out I think pretty much every company that has done that has found the benefits. And okay, there are disadvantages, there are problems, like, you know, inherently there are problems because it's a difficult task that's being undertaken, but there are inherent benefits over the previous slower waterfall type approach.
Thanks, Dave. And can I ask you all to thank the panel? I think it's been an excellent discussion.
Yeah.